and have it open at Revelation chapter 21, verses 1 to 5. 87,000 people dead from coronavirus in the UK alone, and more than 1,000 dying every day. The NHS is facing the most serious crisis in its history. And elsewhere in the world, hospitals are overflowing, people are running out of beds and out of oxygen for their coronavirus patients. The UK national debt is thought to be heading towards £2 trillion. I can't get my head around that figure. I think it's 2,000 billion. It's a lot of money. It's the highest debt we've had as a nation since at least World War II. And that's on the background, of course, of a climate change crisis. 2020 was the joint hottest year ever, and the last 6 years have apparently all been the hottest on record. Some people have said this is the last chance we have to save the planet. We need to act now before irreversible damage and loss occurs. And not just, of course, in our nation or in the climate, but politically too, our world is in great crisis. In the West, democracy is under direct threat, with a bitterly disputed election in the United States and recently a riot at the, in a sense, the home of democracy, the US Capitol in Washington. And in the East, North Korea recently paraded its latest nuclear missiles with now nuclear missiles from a submarine. They claim the most powerful weapon currently in the world. And Kim Jong-un has published his wish list of the range of powerful weapons he would like to obtain in the year ahead. Iran is increasing its uranium enrichment. The arms control treaties, which have stopped nuclear war over the last 30 to 40 years, all seem to be falling apart. And if that all sounds too global and too far away from your world, well, we're in lockdown. Schools are closed. Exams are cancelled for a second year. And there's currently no plan as to what's going to take their place. And of course, we have our personal struggles, don't we? Unemployment, anxiety, ill health, bereavement. Is it still okay to wish each other Happy New Year? Is it too late for that now? Not just in terms of the days that have gone past or where we find ourselves already in 2021. Is that just wishful thinking? Or maybe even a hopeless illusion? How confident are you feeling about the year that stretches ahead of you? And if you can get through this year, how do you feel about the years which lie ahead beyond this one? Well, you may be thinking to yourself, in the light of all of this, feeling it maybe, where is God in all of this? And who has the answers to this long list of crises and problems that we all face? Where is the hope? Where is the hope in this world when it all seems to be falling apart? John, the apostle, we think it was, who wrote the book of Revelation, he wrote down the revelation or the vision that God gave to him. May well have been feeling something of the same. John is writing many years after Jesus has ascended into heaven. It may have been something like 50 years after Jesus had ascended, AD 90, something like that. Jesus has ascended with a promise to return, but he hasn't returned yet. And meanwhile, the church, the believers in John's day, are under enormous pressure, facing persecution from the Roman Empire, the vicious persecution that came under Nero and then under the Emperor Domitian. And John himself is now in exile on the island of Patmos. We don't know much about his circumstances, but separated almost certainly from his family, separated from fellow believers, a prisoner because of his faith. And he writes at the beginning of the book of Revelation, in chapter 1, verse 9, he describes himself as your brother and partner in the tribulation, in the trouble. He writes as a man experiencing trouble to Christians who are experiencing trouble. And it would have been very easy, wouldn't it, for John there in exile on Patmos to have given up hope and to felt that the faith he had and the confidence he once had in Jesus was now slipping through his fingers. So Jesus comes to John in a vision, which is what the book of Revelation is. And he comes to give him hope and to enable John and to enable us to patiently endure whatever we're going through for the sake of God's kingdom. And he writes it so that we too can wait patiently and we can be greatly encouraged. So this morning, I want us to dip into this book of the Revelation. We're going to dip into it right at the end. Obviously, there's a huge amount of context, which we're not going to be able to cover today. We're dipping in right at the end in chapter 21 into the end of the book. And we're going to pick up the theme that we began last week under the title, Behold, I am making all things new. That's the title of the 3 sermons that we've had and we'll finish this morning. Jesus says in 21 verse 5, Behold, I am making all things new. And last week we looked at what that meant under the title of the new birth last Sunday morning from John 3, new life from 2 Corinthians 5 in the afternoon. And today, new hope from Revelation chapter 21, verses 1 to 5. Jesus says to John, Behold, I am making all things new. And verses 1 to 4 of this chapter tell us something of that renewal, what that renewal looks like. You'll see if you've got the sermon outline that I have just made 3 brief headings because I think that helps us to divide up the material. And the first is Cosmos renewed. Cosmos renewed. Now, whatever you believe about the origins and causes of the problems that our world faces, there does seem, no doubt, that our world is in trouble. Rising temperatures and rising sea levels. We talked about the fact that the last 6 years have been the warmest on record. When I did a bit more reading, I found out that 20 of the warmest years on record have occurred in the last 22 years. I looked up what are the greatest biological or ecological crisis that our world is facing. And I came up with lists like these: 500 species on the brink of extinction are likely to be lost in the next 20 years if things carry on the way they are. There's the loss of the rainforest. Some people say only 10% of forest will be left by 2030, and possibly, if things carry on at the present rate, all forest in the world will be gone in 100 years. We've become used to seeing pictures of wildfires from Australia and from America, ripping through communities and destroying towns and homes. And that's not to mention the air pollution problems of cities, the plastic waste, which piles high, and the food insecurity of many communities around the world. So people are understandably worried. I don't know if you're worried. You have every right to be as we think about those things. And of course, radical solutions to all of these problems are impressed upon us. Here's just 3 that came to my mind as I thought about the kind of solutions we hear from the world for these problems. I don't know if you've heard about Christopher Hitchens. He's died now, but he was a radical atheist who spoke very boldly, and he was very clear in his defense of his position that there is no God and can be no God. He wrote the book, The God Delusion. Sorry, I beg your pardon. He wrote the book, God is Not Great. Yeah, God is Not Great. I listened to him debate with John Lennox a while ago on video. And the comment that he said as he thought about the future, he said, folks, we're headed for a whole load of nothingness. That's where humanity is going. The Andromeda Galaxy, he said, is heading right our way. You can even apparently see it in the night sky now. And at some point in the future, Andromeda Galaxy is going to come barreling into the Milky Way. That's going to be the end of our solar system and of our galaxy. We're headed for a whole lot of nothingness. That's what Christopher Hitchens thinks about the future, or thought. He's died now. Or David Attenborough. David Attenborough, you may well have seen some of his programs. Recently, we watched a film called A Life on Our Planet, a reflection on his life, reporting on ecology and biology through the decades. He said, "The Earth is in crisis, and this is our last chance to save it, but it's not too late. We have to act now." David Attenborough advocates going back to saving our species, saving our biodiversity, saving the world by reversing many of the changes that we see around us. There is a chance to go back to what we've had before for a better world. Or maybe you like to follow what Elon Musk says, the founder of SpaceX, the organization which is putting rockets up to the space station. Elon Musk's reason for starting SpaceX is not just to make money from the space station, but he quite categorically believes that the only way forward for our human race is to become an interplanetary species. He said the world is going to be swallowed by the sun, or maybe before that there'll be a third world war. And the only answer for us is to escape the world and to build colonies on other planets. And he has Mars in his sights. Well, that's what these people have to say about the solutions for our world. What does the Bible have to say about the future for the world and the universe? Look with me again at verse 1 of chapter 21. "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more." Verse 1 tells us that God is going to make it all new. God is going to make it all new. Our verses today don't tell us how the world is going to end, although elsewhere the Bible tells us the world is reserved for destruction by fire and that everything now exists will be burned up. But they do tell us, sorry, I've lost my place. Here we are. They do tell us that the earth and the heavens, the skies, the planets and the stars and the sea will pass away and be no more. And in their place, in place of the earth and the heavens and all that exists now, God will create a new heaven and a new earth. Everything that now exists will one day be gone, but in its place will be a whole new creation. Now, if you're anything like me, when you read that, questions flood your mind about what these verses can possibly mean. I think to myself, what will the new heavens and the new earth be like? We thought about that briefly with the children earlier. Well, of course, it's easy to speculate, and many have done so. What on earth will it be like? Interestingly, the Bible doesn't give us a great deal of detail, not as much as we would like. We'd like to know so much more, and it leaves many things as yet unexplained. But I think significantly, there is a new heaven and a new earth. God is going to make this world anew. Last week, we thought about how God brings people to new life and what that new life looks like in somebody's life. And we're quite familiar with the teaching about the new birth, about being born again, and how people are renewed by putting their faith in Jesus. But God's plan for dealing with sin in this world doesn't just stop with making people new. God is going to make a new heaven and a new earth. To understand these things, we have to have in the back of our mind and even in the front of our mind, the themes of Genesis chapter 3. In Genesis chapter 3, we learn that when sin entered the world with Adam and Eve in the garden, the whole of creation was affected. It wasn't just Adam and Eve, but the whole of creation was affected by their sin. And so in Genesis 3:17, when God responds to Adam, he says, "Cursed is the ground because of you, thorns and thistles that shall bring forth for you." And the New Testament picks up this idea in Romans 8, where Paul talks about in Romans 8:19 and 20, the creation waiting with eager longing for the sons of God to be revealed, for the creation was subjected to futility. And verse 21, the creation is in bondage to decay. The idea that the creation is affected by sin. What spoiled Adam and Eve's lives and spoiled their relationship with God also ruined the world. Creation is also affected and ruined by the sin of Adam and Eve. So that with that information in our mind and that understanding in our mind, we come to Revelation 21, verse 1. We find that God reveals he is going to remake the earth, and that his plan for salvation centers on making new people, but includes making a new world for new people to live in. A new place for new people, a renewed earth for renewed people. That's what Revelation 21, verse 1 is telling us. Now, I want to just think a little bit about how this world is going to be the same, but different. Let me just think, first of all, I think in what ways is the new world going to be the same as this world that we currently know? I think we can say something more about the new earth than these verses directly tell us. That is, the new earth is going to be substantially like this earth. There are going to be significant and important differences, of course, but the new earth that God will make will have a continuity with this earth on which we currently live and which we know well. I entitled the point that I've made here, Cosmos Renewed. I originally entitled it Cosmos Remade. And in a sense, that is true. God is going to remake the heavens and the earth. It says that quite clearly in other verses. But I altered the title after a while to Cosmos Renewed, because as I thought about it and read more about it, I came to see that it's as much a renewal of this earth as it is a remaking from scratch. And let me just give you 3 reasons why I think that is the case. The first is the idea of creation and recreation. See, the Bible is a story. The whole Bible is one big storybook with a beginning and a middle and an end, and the whole story holds together as one big story. It has coherence and harmony, and we find that the end of the story, where we are now in Revelation 21, balances the beginning of the story that we just talked about in Revelation 1, 2, and 3. Starts with the story of the creation of the world and the creation of the cosmos. Here in chapter 21 of Revelation, it ends with the promise of recreation. But this new creation, this new heaven and the new earth, has many similarities with the first. There's going to be a tree of life. There's a river, there's a garden, there's people living in relationship with God. There's a strong sense that the new world, the new earth, is going to match and is going to reflect and is going to be a restoration of the first world, the world in which we live, ruined and spoiled by sin. So there's creation and recreation. Here's another reason why I think we can say that the new world will be a renewal of this world. There is an analogy with the rebirth of a Christian. Last week, we heard in the morning about the new birth, how we must be born again to be a Christian. But we don't find that when someone is born again and that they become a Christian, that they suddenly disappear and that they're remade as someone very different in a different place and totally different character and a different appearance. There is obvious continuity between who I am when I'm first created and born into this world and who I am when I'm recreated as a Christian believer. Yes, much has changed. Things have radically changed inside my heart, but I'm still me. I was thinking about Silas. Silas has confessed faith and wants to be baptized. We all knew Silas before he became a Christian, and we know him now. He still supports Manchester City, even though he's become a Christian. He still loves cars and races them on his computer game. And he still lives with the family at 4 Brooksby Close. Silas is still Silas. In one sense, nothing has changed, and yet everything has changed as he's come to faith. There is continuity between who he was then and who he is now. And it's the same for all of us. We become Christians, we're reborn and remade, but there is continuity with who we always were. Here's the third reason. We have the example of the resurrection. Jesus died and his body was put in the tomb. He rose again and he had a bodily resurrection, but the body that Jesus had after his resurrection was clearly, visibly Jesus. Although the disciples and others struggled to recognize him instantly, they did know very soon that it was the same Jesus. He wasn't totally different. It was the same Jesus, and he even had in his hands the scars and his wound in the side. There was continuity between Jesus before he was buried and Jesus after he was resurrected. And we too, if we're Christians, will one day have a resurrection body that has continuity and connection with the body that we now have. We will still be us, even though we'll be radically changed and renewed and made new. God is going to renew everything that he's made, but there is some things which will be the same. And I believe, and that seems that the scriptures teach, that the new earth will be like this world, the same, but of course, radically different. Let's think about the difference. Chapter 21, verse 1 says that the new heavens and the heavens and the earth that now exist, sorry, I beg your pardon. Revelation 21, verse 1 says that the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and the sea was no more. In 2 Peter chapter 3, it says that the heavens and the earth that now exist are stored up for fire, and that the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved. So the earth we currently live in is going to come to an end. It will be destroyed with everything in it that is spoiled by sin. We struggle to understand all the detail, but we have to acknowledge it says the sea will be no more. It says that in the new heaven and the new earth, there will be no temple. There will be no sun. It's telling us that there will be things which are radically different from the world that we're in now. Just a comment about the fact that there'll be no sea. I don't know fully what that means, but the writers that I read seem to say that for John and his readers in that day, the sea represented everything that was dangerous, that was unpredictable. In a sense, it was the picture of sin in the world, violence, a place where people died by drowning, a place from which tsunamis came. It wasn't a safe or a predictable or a comfortable place. And so when the sea is no more, it's talking about a new earth where there is none of the violence, the unpredictability, the danger, the fear that the sea represented for people of John's day. And Jesus says to the Sadducees, there will be no more marriage in heaven. Things will be the same, but they will be different. So I think as we understand this new earth, we need to say that it's the same earth. There's continuity, but or maybe I should say there's closure, but there's continuity. Let me just give you one example to help us just see this in a more down-to-earth way. I know people in the church who love Land Rovers. I like Land Rovers, and I know at least one other person in the congregation loves Land Rovers. I suspect there are more. So we were pretty grieved in 2000, in fact 5 years ago today, I think it was 2016, 5 years ago this month, that the Land Rover Defender finally came to the end of its production line. After 67 continuous years of making Land Rovers, no more Land Rovers. That was the end. Last year, Land Rover produced the new Defender. It's got the same name, and it's obviously a Land Rover. You can see all the connections with the previous Land Rover Defender. You only have to look at it if you know Land Rovers, and you immediately know that's a Land Rover Defender. But there's nothing carried over from the old Land Rover to the new one. It's all new parts, and it is substantially better than the previous one, however great you thought the old ones were. You see, with the car, there's closure and there's continuity. It's a bit like that with the world. God is making everything new. It will be the same, but different and radically better. Well, how does that affect me now? How does that affect us now? 2 brief points before we move on. I ought to say, invest wisely. Invest wisely. If you have some money that you want to save, you might look on the internet or go to an advisor to get some investment advice as to where can you put your money? Where will it be safe? Where's a safe place where your money will grow and it will be there for you when you need it, hopefully with a good return? You might look for a strong, secure bank or a successful company. This world is coming to an end. Even as we try to save it, we live with the knowledge that nothing in this world will remain. in the end, everything will be destroyed. If you invest in this world, you're investing in a losing enterprise. Jesus said in Matthew 6, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where thieves and rust and moth destroy and rust, I beg your pardon, where rust and moth destroy and thieves break in and steal. He said, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Do not invest your lives in this world which is passing. Invest your lives in the kingdom which is to come, where you will be rich for eternity. Commit your money, commit your career, commit your time, commit your whole life to serving God, and you will not be disappointed in eternity. I also want to say, just on the theme of continuity, delight in God's creation. Some Christian believers feel that the answer to the troubles in this world is that one day we will escape it all. One day we'll fly away. This sense that we can just escape from the world, and this world is not our home, and therefore we have no business here, and therefore we have no interest here, and therefore I have no concern for the world around me. But if I'm right that our future home is this world renewed, then we have every reason to delight in this world now, to find everything that God has made as beautiful, to enjoy exploring it, to enjoy photographing it, to enjoy painting it, to enjoy caring for it, to doing the gardening, to raising animals, to traveling, to praising God for his great creation. And we will be involved in this world, reflecting the self-sacrificial love of God in caring for the needy, in being involved in creation care, in being concerned for good stewardship of this world and for all who live in it. Christians should be at the forefront of all those things, but they believe this world is precious, and this world is will be our long-term home. We need to hurry on to two other points, and I'll try and be much more brief on these. We talked about the cosmos renewed. Let's think briefly about communion restored. We find it painful to live in a world that's scarred and stained by the effects of sin, and we've talked about COVID-19, and a frightening reminder that we live in a world where disease ruins our bodies and death robs us of our loved ones, and sometimes it may even rob us of our own lives. But more painful than living in a world like this, which is damaged by disease, is the distress of broken relationships. Most of us in the church have not been affected by infection with coronavirus. Most of us have escaped the infection itself. But I think all of us have been affected by the disruption to relationships that lockdown and coronavirus has brought. Barred from contact with our friends, we can't meet as a church, schools can't gather, we can't visit our families at Christmas. Many of us have experienced the pain of broken relationship or strained relationship, and our society is facing a great crisis, which may be far more significant than the coronavirus crisis in terms of damaged and strained relationships. As human beings, we are made for relationship. Relationships with people can be the greatest source of joy in our lives, but relationships, when they're broken, are often the source of the greatest pain. We were made for relationships with each other, but we were also made for a relationship with God. And chapter 21, verses 2 and 3 are all about the restoration of a relationship. Let me try and explain how I get there. Read verse 2 and 3 with me. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. In verse 2, there are two images or word pictures. And the first is a picture of a city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven. It's a bizarre picture. We might struggle to understand, how does a city come down out of heaven? What would that be like? I think we just need to focus on the idea of what Jerusalem is and what it represented to the people in John's day, what it represents in the Bible. Jerusalem was the capital of the nation of Israel. Jerusalem was the place where God's temple was. The heart of the nation was the city of Jerusalem. At the heart of Jerusalem was at the temple. And in the middle of the temple was the Holy of Holies. Jerusalem is the place where God dwelt. And it's the place where God met with his people, and his people could come and meet with God. So we have a picture of Jerusalem, the place where God is, coming down to where people are. The second picture is a picture of a bride prepared for her wedding morning. Now that's an easier picture for us to grasp, I think. The picture of a bride prepared for her wedding day, beautiful, full of joy, anticipation, looking at her very best for meeting her bridegroom and getting married. So the two pictures together show us people who belong to God, Christian believers preparing to meet with God in joyful union, where in the place where God is. There is a picture in both, there's a sense in both these pictures of a deep, lasting communion between God and people, God who loves people and people who love him. And I think this picture of the city and of the woman have even greater power if we think very briefly about what's come before chapter 20, chapter 21 in Revelation. We don't have the time to read it now. You may want to read it later on, chapter 17 and 18 of Revelation. But in chapter 17, we're introduced to a different woman and a different city. The woman there is described as a prostitute, and the city is Babylon. And these two things represent the people who are godless and the lives that they live without God. It's the whole world of godlessness, people living outside of relationship with God. They are pictures of the world that has rejected God and gone its own way. They are images, ultimately, of ugliness. That's chapter 17. And in chapter 18, we find that the woman and the city, the prostitute and Babylon, are judged and destroyed. The world has turned its back on relationship with God and pursued pleasure in this world and has been completely destroyed. And so in our verses, in chapter 21, we find that the prostitute is replaced by the bride, the purified people of God. We find the godless city of Babylon is replaced by the beautiful city of Jerusalem, where God dwells. In the new heaven and the new earth, God comes and meets with his people in close personal communion. The bride and the groom are finally united in joyful and permanent relationship. I've entitled this point Communion Restored. We thought briefly about communion. Let me just talk about the restored part of that heading. In verse 3, the picture is made plain. The new heaven and the new earth, in the new heaven and the new earth, God will live with his people, and God's people will be in close relationship with him. But if we know our Bibles, we realize that this is not something completely new. Right at the beginning of the story, we read about God's people, Adam and Eve, in a perfect place, Eden, and in perfect relationship with him. God walked with Adam in the cool of the day. There was perfect relationship between Adam and his God. Then sin came, the relationship was shattered. Adam and Eve together were cast out of the garden, sent away from the presence of God. And the rest of the Bible, from Genesis 3 onwards, is the story of the pain of broken relationship, the misery of life lived apart from God, the source of our greatest joy. And so all through the Testament, you can trace this thread of the pain of misery, whether it's the flood, where God judges people because of their sin and the whole population of the world is destroyed apart from one family, or whether it's the people of God come together to hear God's word at Mount Sinai, but finding they can't get close to God because God is frightening and fearful at the base of the mountain, and he's at the top of the mountain and they can't get close. Or whether you read the Psalms and the laments, the psalmists who cry out to God, "How long, Lord? Will you not hear my prayer? How long will you turn your face from me?" And towards the end of the Old Testament, we have the people of God in exile, sent out of the land, far away, with their city occupied and their temple destroyed. You see, the whole story of the Old Testament after Genesis 3 is the pain and the agony of human beings living separated from God, with relationship broken. But of course, there's another story that we find in the Bible too, as we read through it. And that is God's great plan to restore the broken relationship and to bring people back to himself. And woven into the account all through the Old Testament of the misery of people living apart from God, under God's judgment, and fearful of him. We find the promises of God to restore the relationship and to create a way by which people can once again live with God. And so as we read through the Old Testament, we find verses like these. Buried away in some of the law in Leviticus 26, verse 13, God says, I will make my dwelling among you, and my soul shall not abhor you. And I will walk among you and will be your God, and you shall be my people. There it is, hidden away in the Old Testament, a promise that God would one day restore relationship with his people. Or Ezekiel 37, here in the prophecies, the picture of the valley of dry bones, verses 26 and 27. I will make a covenant of peace with them. It shall be an everlasting covenant with them. And I will set them in their land and multiply them, and will set my sanctuary in their midst forevermore. My dwelling place shall be with them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. So it's against that backdrop of the Old Testament promises that we then arrive in the New Testament and read about the birth of Jesus, who is called Emmanuel, God with us. And we later hear Jesus described as the temple, the place where God and man meet. And we find that Jesus heads to the cross. And on the cross, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus on the cross, forsaken by God, as he carries our sin so that we can be freed of our sin and restored to relationship with God. His relationship with his Father is broken so that ours is restored. See, the wonderful hope that God revealed to John in exile on Patmos and to Christian believers suffering around the world in jails today or under persecution today, to us in lockdown in Reading in 2021, is that communion with God has been restored. And we can experience a foretaste of that when we gather as a church to worship God, and we will enter into the full experience of it when we see God face to face and are finally with him forever. Let me make two very brief applications. Make Jesus your biggest and greatest delight. The ultimate joy of heaven will not be your heavenly mansion. It won't be your resurrected body, and it won't even be the joy of being reunited with people who've passed away before you. The greatest gift that God has given us is himself, and the greatest joy of our lives on the new earth will be an unhindered, unbroken relationship with God through Jesus. Make Jesus your chief joy now, because it's in him that you will find your greatest joy in the world to come. And that means cultivating your relationship with Jesus now. You say, well, how am I meant to do that? How do I get to know Jesus now? How? I don't love him. I don't know him. He seems far away. We come to know Jesus by reading his word. We come to know Jesus by praying to him every day. And we come to know Jesus by meeting with his people in the church. Jesus says he is where his people are. So as we gather in the church week by week, as we meet together as Christian believers, so Jesus is here and we get to know him in his word, opened in fellowship with his people. And as you cultivate your relationship with Jesus, you'll be able to sing with greater understanding the words that Stuart Townend wrote at the end of one of his songs. Then one day I'll see him as he sees me, face to face, the lover and the loved. No more words. The longing will be over. There with my precious Jesus. That's what we long for, restoration of relationship with him. Finally, and very briefly, the third thing that we find in these verses to give us hope. In verse 4, we read about the curse revoked. Verse 4, we read about what God reveals to John about the experience of living on the new earth. He says he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. The point here is that the verse majors on what will be absent, not on what will be present. Death, mourning, crying, pain, all gone, all former things which have now passed away. The joy of living in the new earth will include the end of the things that we find so hard and distressing in this present world. We live in a world where often all we know as the reality of pain and crying and mourning and death. Life starts with a cry, doesn't it, from the mother and from the baby. And experiencing living with coronavirus has brought these realities home to us in many ways. Tears, pain, sadness, even mourning and death. Some of us right now are mourning the loss of dearly loved family members. Tomorrow, I will join my family in mourning the death of my uncle, a husband to my aunt, father to his sons, a brother to my mum, granddad to his grandchildren, a friend to many, died. Tomorrow we will mourn his loss, our loss, his death. Death has touched our family, and we know that it's touched other families in the church, and it will reach all of our families, and in the end, it will reach us too. But we need to remember that it hasn't always been this way. Back to the garden in Genesis 3. None of these things were present in Eden. When God made the world, he pronounced it was all very good. And death entered the world when sin entered. The consequence of sin was that God pronounced a curse on the ground and the judgment of death on Adam and on Eve. And so ever since that event in Genesis 3, we've been living in a world under a curse. The world is cursed, and we live with the curse of death. That's why work is so hard. That's why viruses spread and mutate. That's why nothing ultimately satisfies. That's why we struggle with work. That's why old age decays us. That's why death eventually takes us away. We're living in a world under a curse. But in the new world, in the new heaven and the new earth, that curse will be revoked and it will no longer apply. How does that happen? Well, the New Testament picks up the language of the curse and applies it to what happened to Jesus on the cross. Galatians 3:13 says, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree. When Jesus died, he took the curse which had been put on creation. It was put on him. He was cursed so that we might have the curse removed from us. He died, taking the curse of death and pain and mourning and tears on himself. We can be freed from all of those things because of him. And notice in verse 4, it's God himself who wipes away the tears from our eyes. We see in this little phrase something of the compassion, the tenderness, the personal care of Jesus, who was moved with compassion to heal the leper and who wept with Mary and Martha at their tomb when they mourned their brother. We see the power of God to comfort us, not just with sympathy, but he also has authority. He wipes away our tears because he himself has taken away death. Let's just apply this to ourselves. I think we can take away an application of great comfort. We mourn now and we grieve now because we live in a world still under a curse. But we have the certainty that Jesus has taken the curse on himself and has defeated death. Rising from the grave, he has the power to wipe away all of our tears and bring mourning to a final end. We can find great comfort in these words. Trust. The ultimate answer to the tears and struggle and the pain of this life is to commit ourselves wholeheartedly to Jesus, who alone has the power to remove the curse and free us from pain and sadness. The takeaway is that if we want to be free of these things, we must trust ourselves to Jesus, who alone has the power to take them from us. Christopher Hitchens died in 2011, having no hope in the face of death. He was questioned as he was dying of cancer of the esophagus, whether he changed his views at all. He was quite clear he had not. David Attenborough is now in his 90s. He's approaching the end of his life, hoping that the planet might be saved long after he has gone. Elon Musk is in the prime of his life, but his hope is for a future on another planet. Where is your hope this morning? Let's pray.